Hi there.
We're live streaming. She can't see you guys, your questions. If you guys do have questions for us, I will be scrolling through the live chat. But for the time being, we're just going to talk about, what were we going to talk about?
We were going to talk about this skater, Elissa. What's her last
I just
name?
had
I
it
blanked
pulled up.
already.
I just had it. And I'm sorry. This is really difficult. Well, but why did you want to talk about her?
I
Elissa
wanted to talk
Steamer.
about her Steamer, Elissa Steamer. So she's a pro skater in the late 90s, and she still skates, I think. She's in her 40s now. But I wanted to talk about her because a colleague sent like this YouTube video. There's a little documentary made about her, a 4-part thing. And I only watched the first one, but I thought it was really interesting to look at what does a really gender nonconforming girl in a different era kind of look like, and how does her development go? And I just thought it was interesting to compare that with some of the very superficial notions of what masculinity and femininity are today, according to like queer theory, because they tend to be much more about hairstyles and clothing and makeup and toy preference. But I've always thought that masculinity and femininity were much more about just a way of being. Mm-hmm. And like the way someone carries themselves, not so much like what they happen to be wearing or whether or not they're wearing makeup. And so looking at someone like Elissa Steamer, who has a really masculine way of being, was just, I thought it would be interesting to maybe talk about. So I'm wondering if you were able to watch even like a little clip of her.
Yeah, I watched, I just linked the second part of the 4-part Vice documentary because I scrolled past the first part, but I did watch the first part, and they're each like about 9 minutes long.
Yeah.
But she reminds me of girls that I knew and women that I know.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting that the imposition of all these labels just backfires in a way, because like instead of her, the way that everybody talked about her is that, oh, she's the girl, but she's broing down. Or she's like one of the guys, but they have no problem with, you know, having her be gender non-conforming. That's not even anything at all, because they are about the activity. And whether or not she's good at the activity is the central question.
Right.
So were you like that? I mean, like, was that like, I know you mentioned before that you were kind of a tomboy, or you had a fraught relationship with the womanness.
Yeah, you know, as a kid, I think there are things about my personality that maybe you might call masculine, but this gets really tricky because I can just imagine people being like, no, you know, feminine people can be like loud and boisterous too, which of course they can. But if we were to really just think about these archetypal ideas of masculinity and femininity being very demure and a little bit on the shy or quiet side, or I don't know, like there's something about that. That was never me. And I, you know, my parents used to yell at me for sitting like a guy and hooking my like keychain onto my belt buckle, and just have like my mannerisms were always just very, I guess, free. That's how I thought about it.
Yeah.
And there's a certain like ladylikeness that I didn't always embody, though there's a lot about my physical appearance. It's really feminine. So it's not like people ever mistook me for a guy, but some things about my mannerisms have been a little bit more, I don't know how to explain it, just not reserved, you know? And so sometimes that tracks with like more of a kind of masculine persona. Like people that are close to me who know me do think of me as having some of those traits, though physically I don't look masculine. But somebody like Elissa Steamer, she's really, I mean, undoubtedly quite masculine, the way she walks, like the way her posture is, the way she talks.
Facial structure.
And like even, some things about her appearance. But I mean, like the way she carries herself is not feminine at all. But what's really interesting to me is that like you watch these clips of her. So just to kind of summarize for whoever's watching, at least in this first clip, they're in her home, they're interviewing her, they're talking to her about how she got into skating. And at one point they ask her, you know, were there other girl skaters? And she's like, no, like there were no girl skaters. And she clearly had a fearlessness too. I mean, maybe she had a lot of self-doubt, or I don't know. But the way she describes her own exploration of skating was really fearless. And luckily she had a dad who, she said that he was really stoked about it, and he bought her first skateboard, and her family was really encouraging of this activity.
Yeah.
And at the time she was literally the only girl amongst all these boys at the skate park.
Yeah.
And skating, by definition, is also kind of dangerous. You can certainly hurt yourself. People who are pro skaters have probably busted their ass like a million times before they can get good at skating. So there's a lot about participating in the activity in that way that requires a great deal of guts. And she didn't get, at least from what it seemed like, she didn't get hung up on being the only girl, and another thing that happens when you are the first of your gender or of your race or of anybody, like of your category to do something, is all eyes are on you. So there's a certain level of,
there's gatekeeping. That's an automatic gatekeeping in a way, that you actually have to either want to be in that situation or don't care about that situation. So it's going to strain out certain personalities who don't want to be the first, or don't want that extra bit of attention. Yeah.
Or you just have to find a way to hold that and just be with that and not let that take over you. Well, whether she wanted to be known as the girl skater or not, I mean, I'm guessing that she loves skating, not because she wants to break some sort of a boundary, but because she really liked skating and she admired all these people who were really skillful. So whether or not she wanted to be that kind of center of attention is kind of irrelevant. Like, she either had to...
One second, Sasha. We have some connection issues with you.
Against the static. I think you're frozen, Benjamin.
Yeah, you sound like a robot. Can you hear me at all? Well, Sasha, I guess we have to fill up the space. We have some connection issues. This is through Skype, so if you want to downvote me on behalf of Skype, I will automatically give Skype the downvote for this part of our program. Hopefully she'll call right back, and that's what I'll do. I'll call her back. And I'm sorry, I'm on a new setup, so everything is real difficult for me to pull this off right now. There we are. Hey.
Uh-oh, what happened?
Connection issue. I reloaded. What were you saying?
I was saying whether or not she wanted to be the center of attention in that way is kind of irrelevant. Like, yes, there's a certain level of person who, if they find that attention so aversive that it's worse than the joy of enjoying your sport, then yes, they're not going to step into that spotlight. But she might have been really just focused on the skating, but inevitably she has to just accept that that is the spotlight that she then has. She can either take the spotlight and run with it and become really like someone who's willing to take that up as like a part of her identity, or she could just kind of hold space for that being the case and just keep focusing on the skating.
Well, again, I don't think that all this attention to gender and all this identification that's wrapped up with gender nowadays is necessarily beneficial for somebody. I just read Megan Daum's The Problem with Everything, which is a really good short book, and she performs it. I listened to it as an audiobook, and it's really nice to hear her performance of it. She speaks about how gender non-conforming, she speaks about the 70s, how she grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and there was these kids programs where all the kids would be some sort of program where all the kids are dancing or like on some sort of stage, and then they'd talk or whatever, and she described how the kids, regardless of gender, dressed up for what they wanted to do. Not what they were, but what they wanted to do. And now if you watch the same program or similar programs, they're dressed as girly girls or boy boys, or there's this performance aspect of gender. And my question is, like, what does gender performance actually do in the world? Beyond fashion, beyond, I guess, sexuality, like it's some sort of signal for how you want to be treated, how you want to be desired. Like, what does it do beyond, I mean, what does it do, period? To have these, to possess these attributes, and to make that the core of your being seems like such a lost cause. unless you are a performer. And maybe there's something about our culture that now centers that sort of performance in a way, or at least that's what we pay attention to a lot nowadays.
It's almost like there's some intangible force that is always making gender or femininity and masculinity like a central focus of our lives. Like back when roles were much more segregated, a lot of women, feminists, and people who wanted to create more equal opportunities had to focus a little bit on gender, at least, because they realized this is the dividing line that is really determining what options people have. So in that case, we really had to focus on it. And now, I mean, there are, in some ways, obviously gender or sex-based violence is still a problem. I'm not denying that it exists, but there is this way in which we generally have much more freedom of opportunity to figure out what we want to do and what careers we want to pursue. And yet it's like we can't get away from obsessing over gender.
Well,
it's weird.
It's kind of like the race issue where there's so many people with vested interest in keeping it an issue that there's people that are motivated to make this an issue. Like this person who works for the ACLU, Chase Strangio, is constantly making these really big claims about how biological sex doesn't exist or it's too complex, or some sort of weird claim where it's not enough to just be non-conforming. You actually have to go out, for whatever reason, with that person, go out and undermine the science behind gametes or the science behind sex. And I know that there's a lot, and part of the reason that this conversation is so interesting is that there is information that's passed on to our personalities from our sex. And not only sexuality, but a lot of the way that we process information, the way that we behave, what's expected of us, but also how we can function and what we naturally end up manifesting, and then all the health issues that come with that. And if you look at what a woman goes through over the course of her life, that carrying a uterus with you through life causes you to go through major phases.
Are you calling us uterus havers, Benjamin?
Well, I'm just saying that is something that actually has a big impact on a large portion of your energy. Not everything. I'm not, and by saying that, I don't mean that defines you or that you're contained within your biological sex. But do you really have to? What is forcing people or inspiring people to want to smash that or to break down biology for the sake of this ephemeral gender thing? What do they gain from
I mean, well, it's all about tearing down institutions that are seen to be the cause of whatever kind of ism you're talking about. So in terms of sexism or in transphobia, I guess in this case, there is this belief in certain circles that you tear down the entire institution that fed that initial knowledge out to the world about biological sex, for example. So, I mean, I guess that's what it's about. I guess that's why some people feel inspired to do that. But again, I think we've talked about this idea of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You can't do that. I mean, you can make some legitimate criticisms of areas where you think gender roles are too rigid, but you should not attempt to throw away the entire concept altogether. And I think it's similar to people who are gender abolitionists in a way. That's a little bit, I think, of a maybe like a utopian kind of idea that if we never
if there weren't the categories,
anything about
the categories cause oppression. So if we get rid of the categories, there will be no more oppression. I've seen that explicitly stated online.
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully buy into that either. So,
well, did you have resistance in yourself as being female, or were your behaviors just didn't match up and you got a little bit of flack from that? Was there a resistance on your part towards ideas of being a woman? I want to
be really clear. I don't want to make it sound as though I was some kind of outcast or something. I do think I have to credit my parents, because both of my parents have just been very, I mean, they'd make little comments about, Sasha, don't sit like that. But for the most part, my parents gave me free rein to explore anything I was interested in. We never grew up with like really rigid roles of what a girl's supposed to be and what a guy's supposed to be. And my parents always treated me in a way that really made me feel valued. Like whatever I happened to be into at the time. I mean, there are definitely certain things I've gotten myself into that I've either not shared with my parents, or that they would have had, I mean, kind of like, oh my God, what did you do, Sasha, after the fact. But,
Yeah.
you know, I had a family that really didn't try to box me in.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of things that I was really into that were feminine, and a lot of things I was really into that maybe in another family the parents would have, you know, had some qualms about it. So
did society force you into a role or anything like that? Were you oppressed by the patriarchy? Were there corsets thrown your way with regards to your personality?
well, I mean, puberty is a really tough time, and it was a tough time for me, for sure. And so in a way, I mean, if we were to think about, well, what are some of the definitions of patriarchy as we kind of understand it, definitely like getting unwanted attention from older men or really aggressive men was very hard to deal with and really confusing. And there were definitely times in my life that I can think back and say, yeah, this was an abusive person, or this was a toxic person. And now I also have enough kind of space within myself to recognize some of these people were also themselves kind of confused, or they didn't really have their shit together, I guess, in a way. So it's not always just a narrative about oppression. But then again, I really have not been in the type of circumstances that you could point to and easily say that's oppressive. But some women have, you know. I don't know if that answers your question.
Is that, well, I'm wondering because you have, I don't know if you've said this online or not, but you've told me that you did participate in feminism, or you ascribed to a certain formulation of feminism, and then you kind of, it seemed to me that you expressed that you grew out of that. So I'm wondering what was attractive to that, to championing the rights of women, or participating in the world as some sort of struggle for liberation, if that's what you think. And did that come from a biographical need to, overstand the world?
Yeah, I mean, I still would say, especially going into the work that I do now, I still think I'm trying to champion for women. But I'm also recognizing that there are a lot of boys that are equally vulnerable. So I'm not as inclined to say, girls are definitely the only people who are really being harmed by the radical kind of trans movement. But in terms of my own life, I think, like many people who tend to be very concerned about fairness and what's right. I mean, I've always been really interested in ideas and the underdog. Like even as a child, I was really sensitive to that. And so I found myself trying to understand my own personal experiences as a woman. And I think at a certain level, it really helps you to have an organized framework for like, what is all this stuff that has happened to me? Is it just arbitrary? Is it just two human beings interacting in a way that is flawed and can be hurtful and vulnerable? Or is there a system that is set up to do this? And it's a lot more concrete to have that belief that there's a patriarchy that is designed to oppress me and to uplift the people who I happen to feel have hurt me. I mean, that just makes sense, in a way.
Yeah.
And I don't think that never is true. Like with all of these ideologies, I do believe there are nuggets of truth that lie there. It's not just completely arbitrary. But does it explain everything? Is it really this formula that you can plug different life circumstances into and get like your answer? No. And I think I used to be more inclined to use feminist principles like a formula in a way. Like, oh, you can look at a circumstance and easily know, I understand why this is happening because of this hierarchy and this dynamic between males and females and the psychological manipulation. Like, I just thought I could understand everything from that lens, and I just don't believe that anymore. And really, that has a lot to do with just taking more care about what I'm reading and what I'm kind of engaging with in terms of material, and a lot more psychological material, which is much broader than like a strictly like radical feminist lens. But also, you know, the experience of being, like we talked about this the other day, being thrown under the bus by the progressive, I don't know if it's a political party, but just like the progressive ideals that I thought were right, you know, and I realized that there are so many things about which I have tried to speak with so much authority prior to learning about this whole trans movement that I really wasn't prepared to speak about and I wasn't informed about. And so now I've been working in depth with this population of kids. I mean, I eat, breathe, and live this ROGD phenomenon. So I know everything there is to know about it. I know the counter arguments very, very well. I know the research that they've, you know, tried to put forward to support medicalization of trans identity in kids. I understand social contagion. Like, this is one area that I can say I'm really, really confident that I know what I'm talking about. And neither side is getting it right, not the left and not the right. I mean, the right is a little more correct, but they still don't have it right. And so I think that's blown my mind to realize, you know, unless you are really an expert in something, you don't have the authority to sit there on your high horse and say you know what's going on. And frankly, I'm not an expert on human history and spirituality and psychology in every realm. So I can't say for certain what men are and what women are and what oppression belongs where. Like, I think you really have to be a true student of like every kind of philosophy and every kind of world history, because men and women have always existed. So if we want to make a claim,
about what
you
a man
have
is,
to be,
or why,
well, I mean, I know what a male is,
like
but I mean, like the narrative about oppression and patriarchy, like I'm starting to think, you know, I don't know if I feel confident to say that that is a formula that explains everything. Not saying it is, and I don't know if I feel confident saying it is.
So you brought up that you claimed expertise of ROGD, which is rapid onset gender dysphoria, which I think you should probably give the definition of. Like, do you have like a easy definition for that?
Sure. Rapid onset gender dysphoria is a term that was used by Lisa Littman. She did a survey of parental reports about a phenomenon that she had kind of witnessed in her own kids talking about things at school. And so she thought it was an interesting research topic. So she did a survey, and parents basically reported that they had children who did not show any signs or would not have met the diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria as children. But then around puberty, after either a peer at school came out as trans or spending a lot of time looking at trans-related material online, they also became gender dysphoric or claimed a trans identity. And she also documented that according to these parental reports, there was a lot of comorbid other conditions like autism spectrum disorder, depression, anxiety. So it seemed as though there was a social contagion component, and that there was certain youth that were really vulnerable to becoming dysphoric in their adolescence. So I work with this population of kids, and I have kind of spent the last, since 2016, like working in this population and trying to understand what is happening.
So in that population, this is a very fraught topic, because it seems like this phenomena is not, it's very heavily a social phenomenon. This is something that's happening in our period of history in our culture at this moment. There's something going on in our culture and in the medical field that is incentivizing this or causing this. Is that correct to say?
Mm-hmm.
And what are your thoughts on like what are the causes of this with regards to culture and the medical field?
I think there are people who can speak more eloquently about this, but what I think, one of the things I've tried to do is go back and research the history of gender identity medicine. Like, what is this? Because we have this idea now, and you could turn on pretty much any mainstream publication and see transgender children. This is like a word that is used as though we all agree on what that even means. Mm-hmm. So I've been trying to understand, well, what is gender identity medicine? And it seems as though people, historically, some people, mostly male people, have struggled with wanting to be the opposite sex. And a lot of the kind of early pioneers in this type of medicine were, theorists who were trying to understand why this happens, and physicians and surgeons who were doing a lot of kind of rogue experimentation on what can we do to change a person's body to resemble the other sex. And I think, this phenomenon of what was called at the time transsexualism, we don't use that term as much anymore, but some people still do. Some people choose to identify themselves as transsexual. I think because of course, a lot of stigma that transsexual people faced, the mental health community wanted to, I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt here and say, wanted to step in and try to destigmatize that. Uh-huh. And so in the Western medicine perspective, one of the ways that the medical field tries to destigmatize something is trying to claim that it is a medical condition. So, for example, other mental health disorders like anxiety or depression, it's quite contested because there isn't any solid evidence that those are medically based conditions. There's no kind of solid evidence that there's a specific brain chemical or something that causes those things.
Yeah.
But for some reason, I mean, our culture believes that if we can say, well, something is biological, then you can't, I guess, stigmatize it. What we know is that's actually not true, because biological and medical conditions can be stigmatized. But that seems to be the direction that a lot of the mental health field tries to go. Psychiatry tries to go, maybe. So coming up with a concept of gender identity, which is an academic concept, is perhaps a way to have destigmatized the experience of a person who, for whatever reason, chooses to alter their body and try to live in the other sex. And when we take this concept, which is really theoretical and academic, and then we try to apply it in medicine, then you've kind of opened a Pandora's box that is really difficult, because gender identity is something anyone can claim. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just going to make it personal for a moment. I think it was about a month ago, I was laying in bed, it was the middle of the night, and I'm like, do I feel like a man? Do I feel like a woman? What is my gender identity? And I was just trying to feel that. Just like feel my gender identity. And like all I could feel was like, okay, well, I have a body and I have all these senses and stuff. I have an idea of men. The idea of the female, the idea of the male is very important when you're trying to create drama, because all drama comes from the interaction of men and women, or there's always that crossover. That's a very fecund, powerful interaction that is at the core of who we are. Like whether or not you have, your mother or father, we all come about from the very cataclysmic interaction of the male and the female, through a sexual activity that is very intense, very psychological. Maybe this is stupid of me to think it or just out there, but I think that all of that informs us. That's how we're woven together. And yet at the same time, to wear that around like a badge, I don't need that. I can understand why other people, getting to know various trans people, some of them need that, wrestle with it, and others have figured out a way to get beyond it. And some of the best interviews that I've done show people that have already done a lot of the processing, and they're like, this is what I am. But and yet a lot of the activity on Twitter that gets really intense is people that are still not at peace with what their gender is, and that they're kind of on at a war with society, because they're not comfortable themselves with whatever that thing is. And so what you were saying about the different establishments, the academy and the medical establishment have tried to make it easier for these people, but have opened up all of this trouble because they, in this weird way, they've shifted the onus of mental health from the individual
onto everyone else,
onto everybody else, which just, it doesn't add up. It's not
right.
It doesn't work.
Right. I think that's brilliant, and this really kind of loops me back to Elissa Steamer, and I'll get there. But you're lifting up, what kind of traits does a person need to have if they are trans and they've chosen to transition and live in the other sex role? What kind of psychological traits do they need to have to be successful in that endeavor? And it is really having an internal locus of control, because when you are in this kind of limbo state where maybe you're still in the process of medical transition and people can't quite tell what gender you're supposed to identify with, like, you have to be robust enough to say, you know, I know where I'm going, I know who I am, and it's okay if you don't get it. It's okay if you can't see me.
Yeah.
And if we are teaching people that actually every time someone misunderstands you, they are committing an act of violence towards you, you're setting people up to be so fragile. And I've also been really, really impressed with a lot of the trans people that I've met online and through this work, that, like, wow, this is what a psychologically robust person looks like. They're fully aware of the choices that they're making. They understand the consequences, not just medically, but socially, of the choice they're making and the path they've taken. And they are able to integrate their entire kind of life history into who they are. And I read this amazing paper by Alessandra Lima. She's a psychotherapist who works with gender identity. And one paper, she's talking about this young trans girl that she's working with, I think was a teenager or a child, who had this kind of like cutoff date in her mind. This is a male child who identifies as a girl, but this like kind of cutoff date in her mind of when she became herself. And she tried to disregard and pretend like her entire boy existence from before wasn't real, and was really disconnected from it. And it's an amazing case study.
Wait,
and
so you're saying that the child decided at one point, like, I am no longer this other person, and drew a line in their history, and they became their real selves. Think so. And then there was a bunch of fallout or psychological repercussions from that.
Yes, and she talks about how it's almost like, you know, psychological development started at this particular point that the child determined, but really they were very, very much struggling to integrate their entire past self. And so, I mean, I don't remember the details of the paper, but I just remember being struck by this notion that in order to be a psychologically healthy person, this is whether you're trans or not, you have to be able to integrate your life experiences into the current sense of self that you have. And I think there are probably people who have been through really difficult times, and if they try to cut that off and pretend like that never happened, or that was my old me, like I'm a new person, I don't know how useful that is, because we can't disregard difficult experiences that we've had, even if that difficult experience was just having been born in the body that you were born in. So we still have to figure out how to make sense of our particular life circumstances and who we are as a person. And I'm thinking a little bit about Elissa Steamer, because she really had this incredible confidence from what I saw. And that struck me as being very different from the kids that I work with. Because the female kids that I work with, they don't have a lot of masculine traits in terms of their personality and the way they carry themselves. They tend to be really, really self-conscious, really insecure, and that predates the gender identity usually. And so if you don't have the ability to be with yourself and with the way the world interacts with you, I imagine taking that road down a medical pathway of gender transition is going to be really rough. I can imagine that.
Yeah, I spoke with Stella O'Malley earlier this week, and the recording itself got corrupted, so I can't really publish it, or the audio was just horrible. So we're going to set it up again. But she speaks about, she was the host of a BBC documentary called Trans Kids, It's Time to Talk, and it's very difficult to find the whole thing. If you can find clips of it online.
I have it. Yeah.
You have it, yeah.
Amazing. Amazing.
It's really well done. She talks about how heavily she identified as a boy very strongly until a certain point of her life. And hopefully I'll have her back on, because the way that she gets into it tells a story. It's really wonderful. But it seemed that in part wanting to be a boy was it was taking on a warrior aspect for herself, taking on I'm going to embody the warrior in a way, in a very archetypal, very cartoonish way, because that is where I can assert myself and I can protect myself. I'm strong. So in a way, if wanting to become a man is only so that you can be confident, you're betraying what you're trying to be confident. You're betraying that which you're trying to protect by embodying the warrior. You're in a way, and I'm sorry, this is going to tick some people off, but by embodying the warrior, you're sacrificing the princess, right? When it's actually bringing those two things into a healthy relationship in your day-to-day life.
Yeah, that's right. And I do think a lot of the girls that I work with, I mean, I can only speak from my caseload, and I've consulted with a lot of parents too. A lot of them, I think, do feel very vulnerable, and they see this identity as being a way to be strong, a way to be protected, a way to be safe in the world. And they may not articulate it that way, but when you really get into the stories, you realize that this desire for strength and confidence is a big driving factor for some of these kids. So that makes a lot of sense about Stella and her experience.
And in order to be able to diagnose that, as opposed to something very early onset gender dysphoria, I have one of my closest friends is trans, talks about every time they saw themselves in the mirror became physically upset. Like there was a constant driving factor that was tearing them apart with just the way that their body was. And they're very, very smart and talk about how medical transition was very important for them. And I think that is a different case. And it sucks, or I think it's very wrong that we're allowing people to control the discussion so that we can't even diagnose or even talk about the differences between the different kinds of transness. And the people that are very active, radical online are trying to, seems like, I don't know why, but they're trying to obfuscate the true trans from the gender identity thing. And that stuff is just, it's one thing for adults to do that, but once it starts leaking down into the kids and then this whole medical thing starts to happen, then it becomes one of the biggest deals of our time, if that is just accepted across the board.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's an epidemic. I think it's an epidemic, and I think it's the first. I don't know if this is true. I think it's the first wide-scale epidemic involving youth since the age of smartphones. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, this would be, well, for youth? Yeah. Well, yeah, and yeah, for sure. I think that there was activism. I think that in the mid 2010s, there was a bunch of different activist movements that have occurred over and over again. I think that there's political movements. Like I'm sure that we're going to see a lot of variations on socialism going through. We'll see what happens on the national scale with if Bernie Sanders gets nominated and how that translates into a national identity, which will be really interesting to see if America can come to terms with whatever socialism is and stuff like that. And I can see a lot of youth being very engaged on an economic level or on racial justice, but that doesn't have the same life recreating implications as, like, am I in the wrong body? Like that question itself comes with a whole slew of existential questions and then repercussions that would happen. But what was your thought on that?
Just because I don't know how the internet has an impact on this phenomenon. I don't really know how that works, because I mean, I've been trying to study other types of maybe psychic epidemics, right, where you have this vague diagnosis that emerges into the popular culture at this like one period of time, and then the more media reporting there is on it, the more young girls particularly end up having this condition. And so there have been lots of periods of time in the history of psychiatry that this has happened, but not during the internet age. So I just don't know how that variable will change how this fizzles out, if it does. I mean, I think it will at some point. I assume that detransitioner stories and maybe lawsuits will play a big role if this were to shift.
Well, I think one of the things that I've brought up somewhere with one of my interviews was about the internet having the ability to connect people that are such a small population, such as let's just say trans, and these little enclaves on these various different websites, Tumblr or Reddit, that allowed people to connect, which was really good. But when you add that to certain political movements or certain forms of activism, and then you add that to the LGBT rights movements and how they've won successfully more and more rights, and then you have like the momentum of being on the right side of history, and then you have these huge organizations, WPATH and all these different mermaids that are pumping millions of dollars into these different lobby groups. Then it just becomes it's not just that it's no longer just trans people involved in this. This is a huge,
definitely not
huge thing.
I think the way it's being framed for the most part probably doesn't reflect the experiences of most trans people. Well, let me say most trans people who transitioned before the last 15 years, let's say, because I think there's a difference even in older people who are coming out as trans today under this kind of ideological umbrella than, let's say, 30 years ago. If somebody came out later in life, they're probably have a really different like personality profile and like symptom list, I guess. So I think it's really just we've really reshaped what we think it means to be trans and what gender means and what body discomfort means. I mean, there's so many concepts that have been really twisted around, and it's unfortunate. I don't know where it's going to go, but I think, go ahead.
In your experience, what is the best way to differentiate your criticism of the ideology from, like, how do you accept the individuals and reject the ideology? Especially, I guess it depends on, some people are so wrapped up in the ideology that that's core to their identity, so you can't. Have you, I guess you kind of have to walk a very careful line in being able to differentiate that you're here for people, but you still either stand up actively or passively against certain forms of the ideology.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really different working clinically one-on-one with an individual person who's in the middle of, exploring their gender than it is for me to share my opinion as a therapist, kind of surveying this more broadly. What do I think is going on? And I mean, it's not hard to hold compassion for the individual, because I'm pretty sure if I was a teenager today, I'd be one of those individuals. So one of the really challenging things that I have to balance is like, especially with young adult clients, they also have individual autonomy to explore identity in a way that is culturally lifted up as a completely legitimate way to explore identity. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't make sense in a clinical setting to be this like rogue alarmist, because when they look around on their college campuses, according to their endocrinologist, everything they're doing is completely kosher and not unusual at all. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard to gently offer some information or some nuanced perspectives or some challenges when at any moment clients can just say, well, you're a crazy person. Because I mean, my perspective, the perspective that I share with you, within the field of psychology, it's a minority perspective in terms of what people are saying out loud. Privately, a lot of therapists would agree with my perspective. But in terms of, when a dysphoric person goes to a mental health provider or a medical provider, they're most likely going to be affirmed, told that, well, the treatment for this is hormones. And I mean, not even given a second thought about it. Mm-hmm. So it's a really fine line as a clinician that I'm walking, because I think if any of my clients were to see this interview, for example, people I've worked with for a while, they know where I stand, but they also know that in the context of our relationship, I respect their autonomy and I lift up things that might be important for them to know. And I have shared with all of my clients, it's a tough time to be a dysphoric person in 2020, because the information you get, whether it's from a Google search or from your doctor, it's really half the picture. And so you have to really work very hard to find information that will accurately reflect a broader understanding of what does it mean to transition. Because the Google searches that you guys do, that I would do, they're really not the full picture. And so kids know that I feel that way and they understand that. And most of them have heard from their parents, about ROGD and their concerns. So I mean, they're exposed to a counterpoint, but I mean, have you been a teenager? Nobody could tell me anything when I was a teenager. I thought I knew everything. Mm-hmm. And I boldly walked whatever path I wanted to walk. And I also don't think that it's a clinician's job to trample on that, because a 17-year-old is also entitled to being 17. Yeah. Just providing some information or warnings about anything that is permanent is an important part of therapy. But once someone is 20, I mean, you don't want to just be harping on how dangerous this is, because that word doesn't resonate with kids, because according to everybody else on earth, it's not dangerous. It's life-saving. So you're working with people with a belief system. It's a belief system. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So how do you, I guess maybe it's not your job, or maybe it's just something you have to not come out or support by the wayside, because how can you resist a belief system, or I guess planting the seeds of some sort of critical processing of this, or injecting curiosity, fostering curiosity, keep asking questions, keep asking questions, keep asking questions.
Yeah. It really depends on the client. I mean, there are clients who do have a much more robust sense of self. And sometimes I will just talk to them about, have you ever thought, I don't know if this stuff makes sense. And some kids will say, yeah, I mean, I don't get the 600 genders, man. I don't believe in that. So there are kids who we can directly talk about the beliefs. But most of the time, I'm really trying to work with kids on filling the needs that lie behind this gender identity. Mm-hmm. So if someone is struggling with confidence, let's say, or feeling too vulnerable, or a lot of kids I have don't assert themselves ever, and then they wonder why they feel sad all the time, because people are walking all over them and they're jerks to them. So I try to work with kids on fostering the types of abilities or skills that they need to actually resolve the underlying stuff. And I may not say that explicitly. I'm not saying, hey, you won't feel dysphoric anymore if you felt better about yourself. But we just work on those things. And sometimes that can be really helpful.
Well, to go back to what you were saying about feminism or any ideology, it has very few ideologies are explain the world in such a way where human beings actually fit inside of that. Most every ideology is a vision of the world that doesn't have any room for human beings in it. It's this projection. And in order for people to have a cohesive worldview, and to have a belief system, because we need to have a belief system, you need to. They get really defensive if their belief system that they believe so much in is impartial. Like wherever that belief system doesn't work anymore, that's where the panic starts to arise, and a lot of people double down on the absurdity. Like if an absurdity comes up, and you see this over and over again, specifically with the gender ideology, which may or may not have to do anything with what actual being going through transition or even gender dysphoria has to do, is they get really defensive when you bring up the logic, and they make these bigger and bigger claims, and because the internet works the way it does, they have hundreds of people backing them, so that they don't have to necessarily accept any criticism. But you can see that when the absurdity, when the inability to resolve contradiction, the inability to navigate paradox, when a paradox is introduced and somebody starts to overreact, that's more about them butting up against their worldview doesn't match anymore, and so they have to double down. And I think that one of the ways that as a society we can help to correct these rogue ideologies that are like, and I think the transgender ideology is one of the first that has gone with the aid of all this technology, has gone viral across at least what the Western Hemisphere or countries. One of the ways that we can resist this on the large scale is to always treat the individual more as an individual rather than a carrier of that idea. And instead of fighting with them, take a pause and ask a question, or try to connect with them a little bit through these different online platforms. Like try to remind them of their humanity, because that humanity is eventually going to want to get out of that box that they're trapped in.
Yeah. This is making me think about a psychological tool that I've really been working with a lot lately, and it's has to do with kind of emotional based types of therapy, experiential and emotional therapies. And I recently learned about this thing called the change triangle. And it's been popularized by Hilary Jacobs Hendel, who's a psychotherapist, and it was developed by Diana Fosha, who's created AEDP, which is a type of experiential therapy. But anyway, the change triangle is this concept. Sorry to keep it. Is this concept that we all have these core emotions, and they are just built-in biological sensory experiences that will come up for us. We don't control them with our thoughts. We can't make them happen or not happen. They just happen. And when we can actually experience those and process them, they are giving us information about how we need to respond to a situation. And core emotions can get blocked by either defenses, which are anything that we do to avoid feeling our emotions. So working all the time, or drinking too much, or whatever. Or inhibitory emotions, which are shame, anxiety, and guilt. So shame, anxiety, and guilt are actually useful emotions that we've learned to use when we weren't able to feel our core emotions safely. So if you, as a child, get really excited, or you express a really strong emotion and your parents kind of shut it down, oh, don't cry, that's ridiculous, or why are you so excited, calm down, anything like that, we learn to become self-conscious about the experience of having that emotion. And so we learn that anxiety will come in instead of feeling that core emotion. So Anyway, this change triangle is a psychological tool that's used in therapy to help people, A, be able to identify what the core emotions are, be able to access them. And I've been thinking a little bit about how ideologies ascribe judgment to different types of emotions depending on the person who's having them. So if you have like a very rigid ideology about how people interact with each other, how men and women interact with each other, you might end up thinking, well, men should never feel anger if a woman has done something that makes them angry. Like that is a showing of their kind of possessiveness of the woman or something. Now, acting on your anger can be controlling and possessive, and that's not good.
Yeah.
But to have the emotion, to have a feeling of jealousy, or to have a feeling of being slighted, that's a natural feeling that needs to have room in that person to experience it, to process it, to think about it, and then decide, what am I going to do with this? Maybe this is my own thing. Maybe I need to work on this. Or maybe I really need to tell my partner, it really bothered me when you did so-and-so the other day. So if we can actually feel our emotions, we have room to figure out, well, what are we going to do with this feeling? And I do think that really rigid ideologies don't allow people to have certain emotions. I think about like when I was a little bit more ideological, if people would ask me, where are you from? I would get this comment all the time. I have this kind of ambiguous look. People don't know where I'm from. And so there was a time, especially when men would ask, I'd be like, I'd get all upset about it and like, think that it's some sexist and racist microaggression. But what I realized is like, hey, that might be coming from a place of curiosity or attraction. I mean, it might be that too, but there's nothing inherently dangerous about that person having that emotion. As long as I have a boundary of where I feel comfortable or whatever, I shouldn't judge that a person felt curious or that a person was interested or excited. Like that's their emotion to have. I shouldn't be judging that person had it. Does that kind of make sense? So this framework of like everybody having these 7 core emotions, I mean, it's not gender-based. It's not like, well, women have these emotions and men have these emotions. No, we all have all of them.
Yeah.
And so ideology, I think sometimes can make us react with a judgment to somebody else's emotion. Now, someone else's behavior we should react to because maybe they've crossed a boundary or something, and we have the right to assert our own boundaries. But we shouldn't say, oh, when men feel this emotion, that means they are wanting to oppress somebody. Maybe that's just the emotion that they have. I don't know.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Well, it goes back with Elissa Steamer, and there's a difference between an ideology and a culture. She was part of the skating culture, and I'm sure that there's certain... I don't know if that culture had certain beliefs, but I'm sure they had like ways of talking, certain rituals, maybe like certain phrases or like certain like, I don't know if like they ever got in political or had like any ideas about the world. They were more concerned about their activity. It was all built around something that they did. It was all built around something that they did. And being very online isn't necessarily something that you do. I mean, I guess we're all doing it together, but because it doesn't have that, unless you're in some sort of, like we're trying to produce wit, we're trying to produce knowledge, we're trying to have good conversations, like where there is an activity where you're trying to be productive together. Without that, it can just be like some sort of, it becomes an echo chamber, which is more ideological. It's based around producing and reproducing ideas rather than, like just being a part of a culture that has these different expressions or has that kind of thing. So I wonder if with Elissa Steamer, like I was just trying to think about, like she was her in her group, like the ideas that we're talking about now, the ideas that are afloat right now, probably wouldn't help her skate any better, wouldn't help her fit in any
Right.
better. Furthermore, if she accepted those ideas, she would stick out even more by, like, there's certain tropes, by forcing the culture to accept her. You know, like, you guys need to, you know, have more female acceptance, or any sort of activist-y kind of trying to change the world, rather than just finding what part of the world you fit into and entering into an enriching relationship with that subculture.
Yeah, I'm wondering then, is it fair to say that ideologies don't produce anything beyond themselves?
I've had that thought before. There's certain ideologies, let's just say Christianity is an ideology that replicates itself, but because it's undergone 2,000 years of development as Christianity, and then however many centuries more of Judaism and the Greek cultures, that Christianity is rich enough. The Bible itself has enough texture to it that you can really engage with it on a personal level, and you can fit your life inside of it. You can have a family inside of it. You can, and for people who have a more rigid view, it can be very stifling. It can be used to really hem in a lot of different behaviors and be unhealthy for certain outlying personalities, or let's say sexualities or identities don't really fit into it. But there are ideologies that do more than just self-replicate. And I was thinking about this earlier, like with the activism, certain forms of hyper-radical leftist dogma, when they are added to the trans topic, when they're added to the incredibly intimate experience of coming into harmony with your body, yourself, and your world, those ideologies show their utter lack of being able to allow a human being to be fully human. And it really shows, like this topic really shows the limit of oppression politic or all that stuff, because it stops human development, and it actually compounds the alienation. It compounds the despair of it. And so it's kind of dangerous, like, that it's been mixed together like that, not only on a societal level, but because it's just really obvious to me that that is very unhealthy, like, in that context. And maybe there's certain forms of leftist activism that can be good for society. I'm very skeptical at this point because of the stuff I've seen, but I want to be open-minded. But I know it's very obvious that the transgender ideology, the gender theory, critical gender theory, whatever it is, it doesn't really work on an interpersonal or interpersonal level.
And it also drives people further and further into social circles that have fully bought into that same exact ideology. You know, because when you meet people who are really bought into, let's say, trans activism, trans ideology, they're not able to have really meaningful relationships with people who haven't bought in, because it colors the way they see everything. And I mean, I know, as a person who's not a white person, there are some people who their racial identity has become such a central focus of their understanding of the world that they really only feel like they can interact and build meaningful relationships with other people who have that same exact perspective, versus people who are, I mean, like many people I've met through this work, whether they're trans people, white people, black people, if you can engage with the rest of the world and you have all these options open to you, it's a lot more freeing. I mean, you have more choices. And sometimes you bump up against really awful situations, like this experience I had recently, which we'll talk about later. But
you want to talk about that online, or is that offline?
We can. I mean, I don't know. I don't care.
Well, why don't we switch to that? Why don't we open this up for questions? Is that cool?
Okay, yeah.
Like, I'll strain them. I'll put them on the screen. But if you guys have questions for Sasha or myself, go ahead and ask them now. We'll open that up. I can't scroll through all of the. They've been really alive. Talking.
They have?
Yeah. There's like 900 comments. Just
Are you
going,
kidding?
yeah, no.
It's so weird because I mean, to me, it's just like you and I are talking. I didn't think that there are all these people participating.
No, there is. I could give you the link if you want to open it up on your computer, but you would have to be sure to, actually, if you go to the Twitter, I retweeted it. Just make
Okay.
sure to mute your laptop. And
This feels so weird to be like on my computer and talking to you at the same time.
there
Okay.
will be a lag, but you can scroll through the questions will start like coming through now. But you want to talk about your traumatic experience?
Okay. As like a time filler.
Or
Um,
I can fill the time, but Bijou's sleeping next to me. I could show the world that.
oh. Yeah, let's see
Let's
her.
see.
Oh, she looks really peaceful.
Yeah. She's
She's
really been
oblivious.
enjoying the Percocet that I'm on right now.
Why is
It's
she enjoying your Percocet?
because it makes me just like sit down in a warm way, and
Oh,
so she's like, "Oh,
yeah.
okay, you understand what it's like to be me now."
Oh, is that what cats feel like? Just a doped up human?
Yeah, basically, I think.
I look at my cat sometimes and I'm like, oh, you have no idea what's happening in the world, and you're so perfectly fine with your little routine. It looks so fun
Okay, I
to
have a
be a cat.
question here.
Okay.
Let's fix this. I'm having a baby soon. This is Seek Understanding. I'm having a baby soon. What do you think this movement will be like in the next 7 years? And how do I support him in critically thinking about this movement?
Ooh. I think the I think the next 7 years may be too soon for anything to be radically different, though I think things are heating up in some ways. To the second part of the question, I think the best inoculation that you can provide for your son is just a highly embodied experience, meaning make sure that he has a good relationship with his emotions, with his senses, do things together that are physical, away from screens. Not that you should keep him away from screens altogether, that's just the life we live, right?
Yeah.
But having a proper relationship with one's body will at least give some sort of grounding so that when puberty comes, which is just brutal for everybody,
Mm-hmm.
um, that he will understand that all of the he might understand that what he's going through is a really important part of growing up, and it's not a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think being embodied also means having a healthy appreciation for the fact that discomfort isn't necessarily some kind of a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you live your life believing that every time something doesn't feel quite right, that that's an emergency, then it's going to be really hard to go through puberty. So I don't know if that is helpful, but that also means as a parent, you have to have a pretty good relationship with emotions too, so that you can respond in healthy, containing ways for your child when they have big emotions. So it's kind of like goes back to your own relationship with yourself in some ways too.
I want to add to that sports is really good in that respect because it causes you to think of your body as something that you're mastering. Like it's something that you're engaging in trying to master a skill or using your body to master something. So that you're in a position of kind of like the master or servant kind of thing. It's like I'm trying to get it to do this thing, and then you're learning that it takes practice. It takes it takes training. And I don't want to. This might be a little controversial. I don't mean it disrespectfully, but I think that in certain respects, treating the body as something that you need to change through medicine is a shortcut to mastering it, entering into a relationship of mastery to it. It can. I know that there's a lot of people that doesn't apply to. There's another
Well,
question.
can
If
I
you
can I just
yeah,
say something about that before we
sure,
move on?
yeah,
I I'm a little bit weary of this mastering the
okay,
world through the body thing because that still misses the embodied experience. So a lot of times it's pretty easy for athletes to end up with like disordered eating because they do view their body as a thing to master and control. So embodiment is a little bit different. Embodiment is not just moving your body. It's having like a conscious awareness of what it feels like to be in the body without judgment, without saying, oh, this move was done incorrectly. Here's the correct way to do this move. That's still a judgment. It's a body-based, a movement-based experience, but embodiment just has to do with a non-judgmental awareness of the sensory experience of your body. It's a little bit different, and certainly you can achieve that through sport, but it depends on how you're relating to yourself during the sport or during any kind of movement-based thing. Dancers, there's lots of anorexia in dance, and they're moving their bodies, right? So how do you relate to the body as you are moving it through space?
Okay, yeah. I accept that, and I've changed my hardline skill-based mastery view of the world.
Score 1 point for Sasha.
This question is from Lindsay XX, and I think you've answered this a little bit here and there, but the question is, what does Sasha think about the comorbidity of BPD, autism, eating disorders with gender dysphoria? I don't know what BPD is. Borderline personality.
Borderline personality, yeah. Right. Well, borderline personality disorder traits, I'm going to call them traits, because people who have been abused can also express those traits. So I get a little bit weary about necessarily saying, oh, this is just some disorder. I don't know where you got it, but this is what you have. I think those are traits that people express, and they can end up there for a lot of reasons. But autism includes a lot of really black and white thinking. People who are on the autism spectrum tend to ruminate and get really hyper-focused on a narrow set of interests. So I think that can easily translate into this. They also struggle socially, and there's this kind of misconception that people on the spectrum don't care about socializing. Sometimes that's true in some of the cases with boys who are, much more low functioning, but most people on the spectrum care about social relationships. They're just struggling on how to do that and how to connect. So those are some of the factors that can make someone vulnerable to, getting really locked in with this like ideology about the world. And when it comes to eating disorders, it's not a big leap to say, I am miserable because my body doesn't look this way. And once my body is skinny, I'll be happy, to say, I am miserable because my body isn't male. Once I'm male, I'll be happy. I mean, it's not a big leap. And again, a lot of these kids are kind of grooming just by watching just hours and hours and hours of videos with the same message. It's almost hypnotic. And again, that's really different from someone who just organically has developed gender dysphoria in like a more of a neutral environment. So when you have that eating disorder, I think it's really easy for it to translate into dysphoria, especially because with dysphoria, there's a really clear path forward, and it's it's hands off. It's like, well, I don't have to do it. The doctors are going to do it for me. Whereas with an eating disorder, you have to force yourself to starve and be skinnier. And it's very hard. I mean, I'm not saying that eating disorders are good. What I'm saying is if you're in that mind frame that I'll be happy when I'm skinny, it's hard because you're fighting your body to do that. And yet if you think transition will make you happy, well, that's a physical transformation that others can take control of. Like, just get a mastectomy. I'll just get on testosterone. I don't have to work that hard. I mean, it's very hard work to be trans, but it's really different from, I just can't make, like, if you look at a lot of the eating disorder, like pro-ana websites, they're awful, but you see over and over just like this constant, like, I've failed to starve myself enough. I ate too much. Now I have to purge. So it's this frustration of like, I believe this is going to make me happy, but I just don't have the strength to push myself this far. It's really pathological, of course.
And the comorbidity with certain traits or certain autism can lead somebody into the mindset of choosing a goal that contains happiness and the means to get there.
And just getting really fixated on something.
Okay, yeah.
And struggling to see the nuances of gender. But then again, in some of the teaching around gender identity, there is no nuance. I mean, it's really black and white.
I have a softball question for you, or a curveball question. You can make up your mind on this. It's from Grace Zeman, or Zeman. Am I allowed to ask how Sasha keeps her curls so nice?
Sure, you can ask. I was talking about this earlier. It took me a long time to figure out what to do with curly hair. My mom, when I was a kid, my mom has very curly hair, but she used to straighten her hair. So she never really managed her curly hair. And when I was a kid, she just used to brush it. And I don't know if you guys know this, but if you just brush curly hair, you're going to end up with a big poof ball. So I just never knew really what to do with my hair till I got older and started watching YouTube videos of girls with curly hair. And I was like, oh, there's a method. So,
what's the method?
Never brush my hair. Well,
don't brush it.
You never brush it. You can't run your fingers through it or the curls will break up and they will get bigger.
Oh.
So I don't wash it every day. I wash my hair every fourth day, and I put certain products in it, and I either let it air dry or I use a diffuser. I can't believe I'm talking about
What's a diffuser?
A diffuser is this attachment that goes on the end of a blow dryer, and it just really diffuses the air so that the air just kind of gently trickles out of the dryer rather than being a blast, because the blast will also ruin the curls. And so I use a diffuser and use the right products, and
so
very gentle. You have to be gentle.
Curly hair, the state that you're on, there's all these different clans. There's these groups, and they all kind of stick together. And you want to have a certain number, probably 200 hairs per clan, clan, and then that's how
you've analyzed this in a really detailed way. I guess they're strands. So you can, take them and separate them. You'll get a different look. But yeah, you want to let the curls be themselves, basically.
Somebody told me to be careful with the opioids, and so I'll just say that, if you don't mind, I went to a Bernie Sanders rally on Monday, and I contracted something called bursitis, where a packet of fluid in my ankle either popped or got really, really agitated, and that's swollen into a gout-like activity where my whole ankle is embraced by a painful swelling.
Can we see it? Can we see the ankle? Oh, you're all wrapped up.
Wrapped up. So it's this whole part of my body is just radiating pain. So I was about to interview Megan Daum yesterday morning, and the pain spiked, and I about blacked out, and I'm like, I got to go to the hospital.
Gosh.
So I went to the urgent care, and they gave me some steroids and a bit of Percocet. So.
You said you contracted it. Is that the right word?
I experienced it, or something happened. No, it's not the right word.
Okay.
I don't know what the right word is.
It was a mechanical issue.
Yeah, it was a mechanical. I was running.
Okay.
There was a bunch of groupthink, and I tried to run away from it, and I misstepped on the stairs at the Bernie Sanders rally.
Got it.
So that's my story. Okay, let's look for another. That is the right, have it wrong. Oh, okay, yeah, this is something I wanted to ask you. You said that both left and right have it wrong about ROGD, and you said that the right has it less wrong, but how does the right have it wrong? What do you think the conservative ideology, or the conservative groups, conservative people in aggregate misconceive ROGD as? Where are they off about?
I think one common thing that I hear from really conservative families, which, everyone has the right to their own beliefs about things. But I do think that conservatives tend to, again, lump sexuality and with gender identity just as much as the LGBT movement tries to do. So in that sense, they do conflate same-sex attraction with being part of like the trans movement somehow. And in my experience, if we were to let kids just have whatever attractions they have and let them develop normally, they will figure it out. Some will be gay, some will be bi, some will be straight. It doesn't matter. But oftentimes I hear conservatives that are equally upset about the notion that we're trying to make some visibility for gay people. So they think that's confusing kids. And it might be in a way, but it's different if a kid during their childhood identifies themselves as gay when really later in life they're only going to be attracted to women. No harm has been done. Because our attractions are, again, they're these internal visceral things, unlike gender identity, which again, I think is nebulous, and we can end up molding an identity internally that wouldn't have shown up anyway. But I mean, female sexuality is pretty fluid. So, girls throughout their lifetime may experience different attractions, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to end up in a same-sex relationship forever. But if we just let kids have their attractions and let them just be attracted to whomever, that will naturally, biologically sort itself out. Does that make sense? So I don't think we can turn kids gay by exposing them to the concept of being gay.
Okay. And how does that, could you restate how that turns into a gender, confusing that with gender? Do you see
because you can tell kids, oh, there's this concept of gender identity. And if they've never thought about that before and they start thinking about it and ruminating over it, they can certainly start to develop an internal identity that's different from their external identity. So that's much more malleable. You can't trick yourself into your attractions. I mean, certainly there are people who are, let's say, a person who ends up identifying as lesbian and being in a same-sex relationship. There might have been times in her life where she's been in intimate relationships with men and she looks back and says, I realize I didn't have attraction to them. But it's not like you can mold somebody's attractions. I don't think you can.
That's a huge...
Maybe people would have different perspectives on that, but that's my take on it.
Looking for another question. I don't see any more questions. Maybe up
Really?
top. I
thought you said there were 900 questions.
I know, 900 comments.
Okay.
Different questions.
All right.
Oh, you want to tell your story? Or did you want to tell something else?
Sure. Well, there were two things I thought we could talk about, but I don't know if we could just save this for another time. I thought it'd be interesting to talk about how kids are acting as surrogate therapists for their friends.
Oh, and for
Or I could
distrust.
tell my story.
Okay. Why don't you tell your story?
What do you think? Okay. So the other day, it was Valentine's Day, actually, and my boyfriend had been invited to this work party. And it was like a small office. It wasn't his office, but it's like a client of theirs or something. It's a small office. And for Valentine's Day, they hired this like Bob Ross kind of guy to come in with easels and paint and like teach the staff how to make like a Valentine's Day like thing. So I happened to have some time in my day that we could make it. So we go to this thing. And anyway, I've met a couple of these coworkers before and they're all pretty nice. It's a small group, maybe like 15 people. So everyone's like drinking wine and painting and chatting. And so at one point, like the painting we were supposed to make is this, it's real cheesy. It's like a heart, like roses in it, very Valentine's Day themed. So we're supposed to put squiggles around the perimeter of the heart. And one guy's squiggles looked a lot like Arabic script. So somebody else happened to be like, oh, Dave, like your heart looks like you wrote Arabic all over it. And the guy was like, don't say that, man. Like, he got really upset. So then this conversation starts, and my boyfriend and I, who, like, he is also Arab, we're in the back and we're just like painting quietly. And this other lady is like, do you remember when so-and-so dated this Arab guy?
Oh no.
And everyone was like, oh my God, I remember that. And she's like, shut up. You guys are so racist, you know? But then, like, they just started saying all of these, like, horrible things, like
no.
making Al-Qaeda jokes, and
Did they
someone else
not
was like,
realize that you were in the room?
no, they didn't,
Oh,
I guess.
shoot.
I don't know what. So then this other lady was like, would you ever date an Arab? And the lady was like, I'd rather die than date an Arab. And I was just, like, starting to get really upset. So I look over at my boyfriend and I'm like, I'm about to say something and ruin this party.
Okay.
And he was like, please don't. And so I was like, I mean, I wanted to so badly. And I didn't have a good plan of what I was going to say, but I just was getting so anyway, I just kind of like said, okay, these are not my work relationships.
Yeah.
I can choose to ruin my own work relationships, but I don't want to like step on his work relationships. So I just kind of, I mean, I was really quiet the rest of the night, and I left the room, and I just like went to the bathroom to collect myself. And it was just really weird. But I mean, that's, if, you know, it really felt, I think part of the reason it felt so strange is because I haven't experienced anything like that since like middle school or high school. Like there's, you know, in a group of adults, typically you don't hear people go off on like a 15-minute rant about how horrible like a certain race of people are.
Weird.
So it was really weird.
It was
really weird.
I have this revenge fantasy where your boyfriend like whips out like a boombox with Egyptian music, and then you like you throw down all of the easels and you start belly dancing, and then the men like start worshiping you, and the women are like, oh, I can't believe that.
Oh, I doubt that would ever happen. My boyfriend hates Arabic music, actually. So
Really?
that wouldn't happen. That would be like his worst nightmare.
Man, I'm sorry
But yeah,
I'm
it's
glad
okay.
you control. That's weird.
It was really strange. It just felt like a surreal kind of experience, but it's fine.
There's another question, but it seems kind of heavy. I think we should probably end. It's much known about.
Okay. Can I hear the question?
Okay,
I'm not
there's a
gonna answer
couple.
it.
Okay, yeah, there's a couple.
Okay.
This is from Arch Enema 67.
Okay. Love it.
Does teen identity development involve cis or trans females being required to give in to the crushing compensation for insecurity and or gender normative use of disgusting cosmetics? I don't quite understand that. Here's another question. That's pretty heavy. Is much known about long-term psychological impact of impaired sexual function?
Ooh, I wish I knew. I don't know.
That's good study. Good question.
Mm-hmm.
There's one about somebody, yeah, okay. I think we should probably wrap it up here.
Okay. That was really interesting. Thanks to like anybody who's watching.
Yeah,
it
thanks
feels
everybody.
really weird that there's like a live audience, but that was fun.
Yeah, that was fun. We should try it again. Maybe, well, you weren't exposed to all the, apparently I need to dress better when I talk to you. That's a piece of feedback, so.
Why? You're dressed fine.
Yeah, but like, I need to be a little bit closer to your level of style, you know? I just a little closer. I'm down here at Old Navy. I don't know where you're at. You're at Saks Neiman or something like that. So I gotta jump up to Macy's, man. Maybe, or like Forever 21 if that's a thing.
Well, I don't get really. I mean, it's just a top.
Yeah, but they have sparkles.
It's not anything crazy.
Thing, yeah. I don't know.
Okay. Well, you're wearing blue and your eyes are blue,
yeah,
so that's a nice complementary color. Or
right.
The same color.
Why don't you say goodbye,
Benjamin.
and we'll go into.
Okay.
I'll just wrap up the live stream portion.
Okay. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Okay.